He left her pregnant and broke. But 3 years later, she returned with a genius son, shattered his empire, and rebuilt a legacy stronger than his name. This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's about justice, brilliance, and a mother's unbreakable will. You won't believe how she turned pain into power, and how he watched it all from the shadows. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. I still remember the way the city lights spilled through the kitchen window that night, dancing across the polished marble countertop where my future had just shattered into pieces. I stood there in my scrubs, exhausted from a 28-hour hospital shift, adrenaline still simmering from a last-minute pediatric tracheotomy, and in my hand was a small plastic stick. 2 pink lines. A child. Our child. I barely had time to let the joy sink in when the front door opened and in walked Nathaniel Grant. My fiancé, my partner, my person. He loosened his tie with the same mechanical grace that had once charmed me. But tonight, something was off. His eyes didn't meet mine. Not even when I whispered, "I have something to show you." He glanced at the test for half a second before placing his briefcase on the kitchen table like nothing had happened. "We're moving operations to Singapore next month," he said flatly. I blinked, still holding the test. "We? You mean the company, right? Or us?" He finally looked at me. No warmth, just the sharp chill of strategy. "There is no us in this decision, Claire. The board approved the merger. I leave in 2 weeks." I took a breath. Maybe he was in shock. Maybe the long hours had numbed his heart. "Okay, then we'll move together, you, me, and the baby." That's when he said it, his voice as cold and polished as the marble beneath my fingertips. "I'm marrying Victoria Wu next month." The silence that followed felt like a sledgehammer to the ribs. I reached out, grabbing the counter to stay upright. "Victoria? Your investor's daughter?" My voice cracked. "It's business," he replied, shrugging off our life like a coat he no longer needed. "The merger required arrangements. She's part of that." "I'm carrying your child," I whispered, barely able to breathe. "And you're telling me about business?" He adjusted his cufflinks, walked to the door without even flinching. "You'll be taken care of. My lawyers will arrange everything. The penthouse is yours." I stepped in front of him. "Look me in the eye and tell me the last 3 years meant nothing." He paused, met my gaze, and what I saw there chilled me more than his words ever could. Emptiness. Nathaniel Grant, the man who had proposed to me under a blanket of stars just 6 months ago, was gone. In his place stood a machine wearing his face. "I'm sorry," he said, but there was no soul in it. Then he was gone. Just like that. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood frozen in our kitchen, still holding the pregnancy test. The faint beep of its positive result mocked me in the silence. Seconds later, my phone buzzed. A message from Diane Reyes, my best friend and fellow resident. How did he take the news? Before I could reply, another notification flashed across the screen. Grant Industries announces merger with Wu International. CEO Nathaniel Grant to wed Victoria Wu in private ceremony. The room began to spin. I barely made it to the bathroom before my body gave in. Kneeling on cold tile, hands trembling, I threw up everything. My lunch, my dreams, and the last remnants of my belief that Nathaniel loved me. My hand went instinctively to my belly. "You're not alone," I told myself. Not anymore. My pager buzzed just then. Emergency surgery at the hospital. No time to fall apart. I splashed cold water on my face, shoved the pregnancy test into my coat pocket like evidence in a trial no one else would witness, and grabbed my keys. In the elevator, I typed a single reply to Diane. "He's gone. I'll explain later." Heading to OR3 now. The steel doors opened and I walked out, head high, heart in ruins, but still moving. 12 hours. That's how long the shift would be. I could fall apart after. Maybe. The morning sun burned low on the horizon by the time I left the hospital. I drove straight to the bank, desperate to find some piece of my life untouched by him. Denied. My name was gone from every joint account, even my personal savings. Somehow, he'd gotten into that too. I leaned against the cold steel of the ATM, nausea rising again, not from pregnancy, but from panic. Diane found me there, 2 coffees in hand. "You look like death," she said. "He emptied everything," I told her, "every account, even mine." "That's illegal," she muttered. "He can't touch your personal funds." Well, he did, and my keys don't work at the penthouse anymore. "Where did you sleep?" "The on-call room." She handed me a cup. I sipped it, grimaced. Morning sickness makes this taste like motor oil. Come stay with me. Spare room's empty since Jenny moved out. Her tone left no room for argument. We'll get your things after work. My cousin's a lawyer. He'll take your case. My phone buzzed again. Incoming transfer declined. Account closed. The words blurred. Diane wrapped an arm around my shoulder. Promise me something, she said. When you get back on your feet, and you will, we make him regret ever hearing the name Claire Bennett. I smiled, barely. Deal. Another emergency page. I wiped my eyes, squared my shoulders, and walked back into the hospital. That was the night I stopped being someone's fiancée. That was the night I became a mother. And that was the night I swore I'd never let that man define who I, or my child, would become. The first night I stayed at Diane's apartment, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the lumpy futon in her guest room or the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, but because the silence gave my thoughts too much room to breathe. I lay there with one hand on my stomach, feeling nothing yet, but already speaking to the life inside me in whispers. You weren't to start this way, I murmured, but I swear to you, you'll never feel abandoned. Not for a single day of your life. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of burnt toast and Diane's voice arguing with someone on the phone. Her cousin Michael, the lawyer. By the time I walked into the kitchen, she had already printed out paperwork for a new bank account, set up an appointment with HR to adjust my payroll info, and texted her brother to help move what little I could salvage from the penthouse. You're not allowed to thank me, she warned, handing me a protein bar. Eat. We have a 12-hour shift ahead. I nodded, too exhausted to argue, and bit into it. Everything tasted like metal and regret. That afternoon, while I was in the OR assisting on a neonatal bypass, Diane barged in between cases, holding her phone like it was radioactive. Claire, she whispered through her mask, you need to see this. On her screen was a photo from some glossy business site. Nathaniel Grant, smiling his CEO smile, stepping out of a black car in Singapore. His arm was linked with Victoria Wu's. The headline read, Grant Industries CEO Nathaniel Grant and Victoria Wu celebrate merger with private wedding ceremony. The timestamp was 3 days ago. 3 days ago, when he stood in my kitchen and told me he was sorry. I handed the phone back and scrubbed in silently. I couldn't afford to fall apart. A baby's heart was waiting in the next room. In the following weeks, I moved through life like a ghost on fire, burning from within but invisible to the world. The only thing anchoring me was my pager. Every beep, every patient, every case was a thread keeping me stitched together. Then came the morning I tried to pick up the rest of my things from the penthouse. Diane's brother Matt and I arrived with boxes, only to find that the security keycard no longer worked. I called building management. Mr. Grant informed us of a change in occupancy, the concierge said stiffly. I wanted to scream. Instead, I went back to the hospital and performed an emergency thoracotomy on a 3-year-old with a collapsed lung. That night, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not for Nathaniel. For the apartment I'd chosen every piece of furniture in. For the life I'd thought I was building. For the child growing inside me who would never know his father beyond a distant photograph, and a lesson in what not to become. Enough, Diane said the next morning, tossing a binder onto the table. This is Michael's financial plan. You're going to be fine. I opened it reluctantly, and inside were spreadsheets, flow charts, and a roadmap to survival. More than survival, stability, independence. He set up a proxy investment path, Diane explained. It keeps your name off public documents, but it starts buying fractional shares of Grant Industries. I stared at her. Legal, discreet, and, she smirked, poetic. It wasn't revenge, it was insurance, for my future. For my child's. By month 4, I was back to full shifts and taking on more surgeries than ever. Morning sickness had dulled into a background hum, like an elevator that never quite reached the right floor. I learned to live with it. And I was good. Damn good. The attending surgeon started requesting me by name. Nurses noticed how calmly I handled chaos. I was rising. Then one afternoon, as I exited the OR after 6 straight hours repairing a ventricular septal defect, my legs buckled. I sat in the staff lounge, dizzy and soaked in sweat. Diane rushed in with a Gatorade and a look that could kill. You're not a superhero. I'm not trying to be, I murmured. Yes, you are, she snapped, sitting next to me. And I get it, Claire, but you're carrying someone else now. Someone who's counting on you. I placed a hand over my belly. The bump was just starting to show. Here, she's strong, I whispered. I can feel it. You're strong, she corrected. But that doesn't mean you have to be alone. She meant it as support. I heard it as warning. The next week, Michael brought me something wrapped in a legal envelope. This is the first NDA, he said carefully. They're trying to silence you. I opened it. Nathaniel's lawyers offering a six-figure gesture in exchange for my silence about the pregnancy. The sheer audacity made me laugh. I'm not signing that. Good, Michael said, tapping the page. Because by not signing, we maintain leverage. Let him keep throwing money at the problem, I said. I'll keep building the solution. As my belly grew, so did my resolve. I lived in a whirlwind of surgery, prenatal checkups, and long hours at my laptop tracking every movement Grant Industries made. The stock rose, so did my investment, quietly inching upward behind the scenes. I stopped looking at his photos. I stopped reading the press releases. But I never forgot. The night before my 7th month began, I was called into the hospital for a pediatric cardiac emergency. I arrived in sweats, fully prepared just to consult. The child was 6 years old. Cyanotic, the kind of case I'd studied 1,000 times, but never expected to face with a baby kicking beneath my ribs. I can handle this, the lead surgeon said, eyeing my belly. I've reviewed his scans, I replied. You'll need someone who understands congenital asymmetry. I'm scrubbing in. The OR staff exchanged glances. No one stopped me. I operated for 4 hours. I didn't feel the pain in my back or the burning in my legs until the final stitch was placed and the heart monitor steadied into a perfect rhythm. The child would live. I turned to the nurse. Close for me. Claire, you're bleeding. It wasn't blood. It was amniotic fluid. Labor, I whispered. I think I'm in labor. They rushed me to maternity. Diane was already waiting, scrubs still on. 14 hours later, Elliot James Bennett entered the world, screaming with defiance and kicking like he already had something to prove. He looks like him, I said softly, staring into those storm-colored eyes. He looks like you, Diane corrected, brushing hair from my face. Strong, brilliant, unshakable. The nurse brought in a massive flower arrangement the next morning. No note, just a small card tucked between lilies. Congratulations, Claire. Elaine Grant. I almost asked Diane to throw them away, but I didn't. She still is grandmother, I said, whatever else she is. Later, as I held Elliot to my chest and watched his tiny chest rise and fall, I knew this moment would become the one I returned to over and over. Not the betrayal, not the heartbreak. This, the beginning of everything real. I wasn't a surgeon carrying a child anymore. I was a mother who happened to save lives. And that made me unstoppable. The first year of Elliot's life was a blur of sleepless nights, emergency calls, and late-night feedings on a worn-down couch in Diane's apartment. I learned to balance a scalpel in one hand and a bottle in the other. My life became a rhythm of heartbeats, his, mine, and the ones I was trusted to repair at the hospital. There were nights I fell asleep with surgical notes open on one knee, and Elliot curled into my chest like a puzzle piece that had finally found its place. I had nothing that resembled the life I'd imagined with Nathaniel. No penthouse view, no quiet weekends sipping wine over design plans for a nursery. But what I had was something stronger. I had clarity. Every decision now had a singular purpose. Elliot's future. And maybe mine too. By the time Elliot turned 1, I had returned to full-time surgery, with my fellowship in pediatric cardiac innovation nearing completion. My technique, one I'd been quietly developing through months of field notes and sketches, was gaining attention among my colleagues. It was a minimally invasive procedure designed for infants with congenital valve defects. I'd tested it on simulations, reviewed hundreds of case studies, and worked under some of the best minds in the field. But now, it was mine. Diane called it the Bennett Protocol. I told her to stop naming things after me. She never listened. While I was scrubbing in, Diane managed everything else. She kept Elliot entertained in the staff lounge with puzzles and picture books, arranged babysitting with surgical interns, even taught him how to say scalpel before he could properly pronounce cookie. And he was smart, alarmingly smart. By 2, Elliot could assemble 50-piece puzzles in minutes. He recognized heart diagrams and matched them with correct anatomical terms. I once caught him watching a video on pediatric anatomy while stacking toy blocks in the shape of a 4-chamber heart. "You know he's a genius, right?" Diane said, watching him with a raised brow. "He's not just smart, he's next level." "He's 2, I reminded her. "He still thinks flushing the toilet is a magic trick." "Yeah, but he also just corrected my pronunciation of septum primum." There were moments when I looked at Elliot and saw flashes of Nathaniel, his dimples when he laughed, the angle of his jaw when he concentrated, but it never hurt the way I expected. If anything, it grounded me. Elliot may have been born from heartbreak, but he was never defined by it. He was becoming his own person, and I was becoming mine. The week before his 3rd birthday, I received a letter from the board at Henderson Memorial. They had approved full funding for my research proposal. Not just token support, complete backing. Lab space, a small team, and pilot patients. My heart skipped a beat reading the letter. I wasn't just another resident with a good idea anymore. I was a lead researcher, a name on something that could change hundreds of lives. I walked into the apartment, still holding the envelope, and found Diane building a fort out of couch cushions, while Elliot declared himself chief heart doctor of the Pillow Kingdom. "They funded it," I whispered. She looked up. "Wait, you mean?" "All of it," I said, laughing now, overwhelmed. "They approved the entire protocol." Elliot ran up, tugging my pant leg. "Mommy, did the heart magic win?" "Yes, baby," I said, crouching down to scoop him up. "The heart magic won." Later that night, while Elliot slept and Diane binge-watched surgical horror stories on her tablet, I pulled up my investment tracker. The portfolio Michael had created had grown steadily over the years. My holdings, technically owned by an anonymous shell company, now accounted for nearly 6% of Grantech's private shares. I stared at the numbers, then added in another number. Elaine's name had appeared on the donation list for our research center more than once. Her notes were always simple, sometimes signed only with a single initial. But they were real. I didn't know if Nathaniel knew. I didn't care. Because this wasn't about him. This was about Elliot, about building something no one could take away from him. Not a merger, not a man, not even fate. 3 more years, I whispered aloud. Diane looked up from her tablet. "Until what?" "Until I control enough of the company to make a real impact." She tilted her head. "You're planning a corporate coup with a toddler as your co-investor?" I shrugged. "I'm planning a future." Diane leaned back, impressed. "Remind me never to cross you." The next day, Elliot woke up sneezing. I canceled my meetings, kept him home, and watched as he demanded to see his own x-rays from a checkup a month ago. "I want to see my ribcage bones," he said, arms flailing. Later, after nap time, he curled up beside me on the couch. "Do I have a daddy?" I froze. The question had landed softly, but it still knocked the breath out of me. "You do," I said carefully, "but he doesn't live with us." "Why not?" I looked down at him, his eyes so open, so painfully trusting. "Because some people make bad choices, but you and me, we're building something different." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. A week later, I received a package at the hospital. Inside was a photo of Nathaniel and Victoria Wu at a tech expo in Tokyo. Their smiles were hollow. His eyes, once so quick to light up, looked tired. Beneath the photo was a note from Elaine, handwritten. "He doesn't know what he lost, but I do. Thank you for loving my grandson, E." I stared at the words for a long time, then slid the note into my drawer, right beside Elliot's birth certificate and my original research sketch. The 3 of us, Elliot, Diane, and I, celebrated his 3rd birthday in the hospital's pediatric lounge. Cupcakes, balloons, and a tiny plastic stethoscope that he insisted on wearing all day. He examined every nurse and doctor who walked by. "Your heart sounds happy," he told one gruff surgeon who later cried in the supply closet. "Claire," Diane said quietly that evening as we watched Elliot fall asleep under a pile of dinosaur blankets. "I don't know how you do it." "I don't," I admitted. "Some days I don't, but then he smiles, or he learns a new word, or he reminds me why I stayed. Why I kept fighting." Diane nodded, her voice soft. "You turned heartbreak into legacy." I looked at my son, at the future that was slowly unfolding. "No," I said, wrapping the blanket tighter around him. "I turned him into my home. And I would protect that home with everything I had. Because love, when it's tested, doesn't crumble. It builds, brick by brick. one heartbeat at a time. 3 years had passed since Nathaniel Grant walked out of my life and into a boardroom marriage. I hadn't seen him since, not in person, but his face was hard to escape. It lingered on billboards, news alerts, financial columns. The man who once whispered promises to me under a starlit sky now smiled from behind podiums, pitching visions of innovation while sipping champagne with people who called betrayal strategy. I never expected our paths to cross again, and certainly not the way they did. It started with an invitation, an embossed envelope delivered to my research office at Henderson Memorial. Inside, a handwritten note from the hospital's board. I had been selected to receive the Innovator in Pediatric Surgery Award at the annual Children's Cardiac Gala. My hands shook a little as I held the letter, then steadied. This wasn't just about me anymore. Elliot, now 3, had watched me build this piece by piece. He understood more than any child his age should. Cardiac structures, valve design, research ethics. He was still learning how to tie his shoes, but he could already spell atrioventricular. I wanted him there that night. Not just to witness it, but to be part of it. My greatest invention holding my hand as I received recognition for a technique that might one day save thousands. Still, I hesitated. The gala was high profile, which meant Nathaniel would be there. Grant Tech was one of the hospital's largest donors, and even if the press had gone quiet about his crumbling marriage, his face still sold headlines. But this night wasn't his. It was mine, and Elliot's. Diane helped me get ready the evening of the event, her usual sarcasm replaced with something tender as she zipped up my emerald green gown. "You look like revenge dressed in elegance," she smirked. I laughed, but my nerves coiled tight. "Do you think it's wrong to bring him?" "Wrong? Claire, this is the exact kind of night he'll remember forever, and he deserves to see exactly what strength looks like. He deserves to know this story ends with you winning." Elliot peeked into the room then, wearing a miniature tuxedo that nearly broke my heart. "Dr. Mommy, is it time to fix hearts yet?" I knelt to kiss his forehead. "Almost, sweetheart." We arrived at the gala as cameras flashed and voices murmured. But all the noise faded when Elliot reached for my hand and squeezed. I looked down at him, at those bright eyes so full of curiosity and calm. He steadied me in ways no adult ever had. The ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers and too much perfume. I recognized faces from the hospital, donors, colleagues, strangers in designer suits. Diane moved off to coordinate with the event staff, and Elliot and I found our way to our assigned table near the stage. That's when I saw him. Across the room, near the bar, older but unmistakable. Nathaniel Grant. He looked different, tired, thinner, his tailored suit unable to mask the wear behind his eyes. But still, when our gazes met, the air shifted. He didn't move. Neither did I. The MC called my name. I stood, heart pounding, and turned to Elliot. "Remember what we practiced?" He nodded solemnly. "I give you the special doctor prize and say, 'Congratulations, Dr. Mommy.'" "Perfect," I whispered. We walked up the steps together. The spotlight warmed my skin, but all I could feel was the tiny hand clutching mine with complete trust. I turned to the audience, cleared my throat, and began. 3 years ago, I realized something about tiny hearts. They're remarkably resilient. They heal. They grow stronger. And sometimes they teach us more about courage than any textbook ever could. I didn't speak about Nathaniel. I didn't need to. My words carried the weight of everything he had tried to erase. But the greatest thank you tonight goes not to the children I've treated, but to one small person, my son Elliot, who has taught me that the strongest hearts aren't always the ones we operate on. Right on cue, Elliot stepped forward, holding the crystal award with both hands. "Congratulations, Dr. Mommy," he said into the microphone, drawing a wave of laughter and applause that broke the tension in my chest. I hugged him, the award forgotten in my hands. For a moment, everything else vanished. I didn't care who was watching, but someone was. Later, back at our table, Diane leaned over. "He's gone. Left right after your speech." I didn't ask who. I already knew. I watched Elliot charm half the hospital board with his detailed knowledge of mitral valves, his cheeks glowing with pride. "He looked shocked," Diane added, sipping her champagne. "Seeing Elliot, it must have reminded him what he gave up," I said quietly, gaze fixed on my son. "He made his choice." Elliot returned to our table, babbling about a doctor who had let him hold a stethoscope with his name on it. "Mommy, can we see the fish tank again?" "Of course, baby." But before we could leave, a nurse approached. "Dr. Bennett, we have an emergency case coming in. They're asking for you." I looked at Diane, already reaching for Elliot's hand. "Go," she said. "We'll handle the fish." I kissed Elliot goodnight, whispered, "Be good for Aunt Diane," and stood. "Save the tiny heart, Mommy," he called as I turned toward the elevator. His words landed somewhere deeper than my chest. Back in the hospital wing, scrubbed in and focused, the echoes of the gala melted away. My patient needed me. There was a rhythm to this work, a purpose that no amount of personal history could ever shake. The next morning, as I reviewed notes with the surgical team, someone's phone buzzed. "Crawford CEO leaves gala early," the headline read. I didn't react. Later that afternoon, my assistant walked into my office with a puzzled look. "You have a call from Singapore," she said. "Not interested." "It's not him," she replied. "It's Victoria Wu." I paused. "She says it's about your shares in the company." My stomach twisted. I'd spent years carefully buying those shares, hiding behind layers of anonymity. If she knew? Before I could process, my phone buzzed again. A text from Diane. "Elaine's been admitted. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer." The pen slipped from my fingers. Everything was shifting again, but I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. The story wasn't finished yet. It was about to change. Again, and this time I would be the one turning the page. When I stepped into Elaine Grant's hospital room, the first thing I noticed was how small she looked. The elegance that used to command attention in boardrooms and charity galas had been stripped away, replaced by the frailty of a woman who knew her time was slipping through her fingers. Yet her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, had lost none of their fire. "Singapore?" she asked softly, her voice worn thin. I nodded, stepping closer, my white coat still damp from the drizzle outside. "Helen Wu called me." Elaine smiled faintly. "Clever girl, she's getting ready to file for divorce. She thinks she can take the board with her." I checked the monitors, partly out of habit, partly to ground myself in something clinical. "She said it's about my shares." "It is," Elaine murmured. "But that's not why I asked you here." I looked at her, waiting. "She wants to use you," Elaine continued, "to force Nathaniel out. She thinks your silence means weakness. But I know better." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She already knew. Elaine reached for something on the nightstand. A folder, thick, sealed, already creased at the corners. "These are transfer papers. I've signed over my remaining shares in Grantech to Elliot." The breath caught in my throat. "Lucas," I corrected gently, using his middle name, the one Nathaniel never knew we gave him. Elaine smiled. "Lucas, then. I did it legally, quietly, before starting this last round of treatment. No one can contest it. You now control 18% of the company." I sank into the chair beside her bed, unable to speak. "You know what that means, don't you?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "With my shares and his, we have the largest block of control. Enough to decide who sits at the head of the table," she whispered. "Enough to take back what should have never been handed away in the first place." There was silence between us for a long moment. Not awkward, just full. "Do you want him to know?" I asked finally. She closed her eyes briefly, as if the question exhausted her. "What I want is to see my grandson, while I still can. The rest is business." I touched her hand, the skin papery under my fingers. "I'll bring him after my next surgery." As I stood to leave, she opened her eyes again. "Claire," she said, voice suddenly sharp. "When Helen calls again, listen closely. Sometimes revenge and justice look a lot alike. You'll have to decide which one you're serving." I didn't answer her right away. I left the room and found myself staring out the window, watching as rain traced slow lines down the glass. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my travel agent. First-class tickets to Singapore. Confirmed. That night, I watched Lucas sit beside Elaine's hospital bed, holding her hand and explaining his latest heart valve model, like he was speaking to a research team instead of a dying grandmother. He had no idea what kind of war he was being drawn into. But he didn't need to know. Not yet. My job was to build his world, not make him defend it. The morning I boarded the plane, Diane hugged me tightly at the gate. "Are you ready to face him?" "No," I said honestly, "but I'm not here for him." She nodded. "Call me when it's done." In Singapore, the boardroom smelled like polished mahogany and old money. Everyone rose when I entered, including Nathaniel, who had clearly not been warned. He paled when he saw me. His eyes locked on mine, searching for something, recognition maybe, or mercy. He found neither. Helen sat at the center of the table, perfectly poised. She didn't smile, but the slight raise of her brow was enough to tell me this was her move, and she expected me to play along. The Board of Grant Technologies will now hear from Dr. Claire Bennett, the chairperson announced. I took a breath. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. Before I begin, I said calmly, I'd like to share something with all of you. I connected my laptop to the display screen. A video began to play. Lucas, sitting at his little desk, solving complex equations, walking through a whiteboard presentation he had made with Diane's help. The camera zoomed in on his drawings of heart valves and his voice, high but steady, explaining how he hoped to make surgeries safer for kids like him. This is Lucas Bennett Grant, I said, facing the room. IQ tested at 164, gifted program student, my son. A stunned silence swept the room. I turned toward Nathaniel. Our son. The boardroom erupted. Nathaniel gripped the table with white knuckles, his face drained of color. Claire? I didn't give him the chance. I'm voting my shares, and my son's shares, in favor of the restructuring proposal, I said, locking eyes with Helen. Nathaniel Grant is hereby removed as CEO of Grant Technologies. Papers rustled. Voices rose in protest and disbelief. I closed my laptop with a soft click. I have a patient waiting, I said. My lawyer will handle everything else. I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out, heels clicking against the polished floor, already reaching for my phone. A message from Diane had just come through. Elaine's crashing. Get back now. I was on the next flight out. Elaine passed away an hour before I landed. Lucas had been holding her hand, reading her one of his favorite anatomy books. He didn't cry, not right away. He just sat there quietly, fingers still laced through hers, as if waiting for her to wake up and finish the chapter. Diane met me at the hospital doors. She left something for you. In my office, she handed me a sealed envelope and a USB drive. I opened the letter first. Dearest Claire, by now the board meeting is over. I hope you showed them the mine they threw away. This is my last gift to you, proof that Nathaniel didn't just leave you. He committed fraud to do it. The USB holds everything. Merger documents, backdated agreements, hidden accounts. Use it wisely, not for revenge, but for Lucas. He'll need protection from the storm that's coming. Love him enough for both of us, Elaine. I stared at the drive in my hand. Nathaniel hadn't just betrayed me. He'd broken the law to do it, covered it with contracts, buried it under business deals. And now the truth was mine to wield. My phone buzzed again. An incoming call from Nathaniel. Don't, Diane warned, but I answered. Silence stretched across the line. Why? He asked finally. You lost the right to ask that 3 years ago, I said coldly. The company is Helen's now. The truth is yours to deal with. Claire, please. Goodbye, Nathaniel. I hung up and blocked his number. One final time, I turned toward Lucas, asleep on the couch beside a pile of heart diagrams and picture books. My son, my miracle, the legacy they never saw coming. I reached for my pen and a fresh envelope. My dearest Lucas, I wrote, your father chose an empire of steel and silence. I chose you. The easiest decision I've ever made. Love, Mom. Some empires collapse with headlines. Ours would rise quietly, one heartbeat at a time. In the weeks that followed Elaine's funeral, it felt as if the world had paused to take a breath and then released it all in a storm of noise. News broke of Helen Wu filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and gross misconduct in corporate dealings. Grant Tech stock tumbled. Journalists hunted for answers behind the boardroom upheaval, speculating about the mysterious investor who had helped remove Nathaniel Grant. None of them knew the truth. Not yet. And I had no intention of giving them a headline they hadn't earned. My focus was here, on my work, my son, and the quiet power I now held. Lucas turned 4 that month. We threw him a small party in the hospital's rooftop garden. There were dinosaur cupcakes, a science experiment corner, and a magician who wore a lab coat. Lucas insisted on performing a heart check on every guest using his toy stethoscope. Even the hospital administrator played along, letting Lucas diagnose him with a giggle condition. After the candles were blown out and the guests trickled away, I found Lucas on the edge of the garden, staring up at the city skyline. "Do you think my dad lives in one of those buildings?" he asked suddenly. I froze. "He might," I said gently, But he doesn't live in our world, sweetheart. Ours is better. Lucas thought about that for a moment. Because we fix hearts? I smiled. Exactly. I didn't tell him that his father had tried to see him, again. That a few days earlier, Nathaniel had shown up in the hospital lobby unannounced, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow, envelope in hand. My mother left this for him, he said. I just want a moment. Security stood at a distance, already briefed. I'd told them if Nathaniel ever showed up, I wanted to be warned before they acted. I'll be brief, he repeated. He handed me the envelope, fingers brushing mine for the first time in 4 years. Inside was a trust document, Elaine's final gift. An educational endowment for Lucas, prepared by her attorneys and held in a private account. But there was something else. Another envelope. My letter to him, Nathaniel said. For when he's older. I didn't open it, just nodded. Thank you. He stepped back but lingered, eyes darting across the lobby like a man looking for pieces of something he lost long ago. I want to meet him. No, I said simply. He's not a company, he's a child, our child. No, I repeated, colder this time. He's my child, the one you walked away from. Nathaniel's voice cracked. The merger, it was a mistake, all of it. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, I snapped. You made your choice, now live with it. Security stepped in, but Nathaniel didn't resist, just handed me one final envelope. For him, please. He left without another word. That night, I added both letters, his and Elaine's, to a safety deposit box. I'd give them to Lucas when he turned 18, when he was ready, when the past could no longer touch the shape of his future. For now, I had surgeries to perform, innovations to finalize, a life to keep building. Grant Tech's legal team tried to contact me multiple times. Helen's attorneys offered partnership opportunities, endorsements, even seat positions. I ignored them all. The only thing that mattered was Lucas, and making sure his name, his legacy, would never be tied to scandal. Still, the headlines came like clockwork. Grant Tech under investigation for fraudulent merger deals. Former CEO Nathaniel Grant faces sex scrutiny. Unnamed board member holds powerful stake. Who is she? And through it all, Lucas thrived. He passed his first entrance assessment for the gifted medical program, a curriculum built for students twice his age. The committee had asked if he understood what he was signing up for. He nodded solemnly and explained cardiac shunting mechanisms until the panel sat speechless. He's not just gifted, one doctor said. He's focused. They didn't know where that focus came from. It came from every night I whispered stories to him about real heroes. Surgeons who saved lives, researchers who chased miracles, women who turned ashes into blueprints. It came from the calm that settled in him when he watched me scrub in, from the way he mirrored my confidence when explaining his designs. One morning, I found him at the kitchen table sketching a new heart valve on the back of his cereal box. This one's smaller, he told me. It'll work for babies. I kissed his head. Breath caught in my throat. It just might. At the hospital, my own surgical technique, refined over years of testing, failure, and relentless tinkering, was becoming the new standard for pediatric cardiac repair. I had just received word that Hopkins wanted me to present it at their international conference in Baltimore. I told Lucas over dinner. Will there be fish? He asked. Fish? At the aquarium? You promised if we ever went to Baltimore, I laughed. Yes, baby, we'll see the fish. The next day, he ran through the hospital wing, telling every nurse, doctor, and custodian about his upcoming heart-saving trip. Diane printed him a badge that read Dr. Lucas Bennett, Junior Consultant. He wore it everywhere, including to bed. The night before we left, a nurse handed me a sealed letter. It was from the state. Nathaniel's petition for visitation rights had been denied. I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. It was over. The next morning, Lucas and I flew to Baltimore. I gave my speech at the conference, standing in a room of hundreds, the spotlight warm, the applause louder than I expected. But what mattered most was the little boy in the front row, clapping harder than anyone else, eyes shining. Later, when I hugged him, he whispered, "One day I'll give a speech too. I'll be there in the front row, I promised." Back at the hotel, he unpacked his portable clinic set, stethoscope included, and performed a full examination on my ankles. "You walk too much, Dr. Mommy. I prescribe ice cream." "I'll take 2 scoops, I grinned. That evening, as we watched jellyfish float through blue-lit tanks at the Baltimore Aquarium, Lucas tugged on my hand. "I love you, Mommy." I knelt to his level, kissed his forehead, and smiled through tears. I love you more. No cameras, no headlines, no legacy measured in stock price. Just a boy with a brilliant mind, a heart full of light, and a mother who chose him every single time. Whatever Nathaniel had built, it was crumbling. His empire of glass was shattering under the weight of truth. But mine, ours, it was just beginning, and it would last. By the time Lucas turned 6, he wasn't just reading medical journals, he was commenting on them. He had his own desk in the pediatric research wing, complete with a tablet, a stack of anatomy books, and a rotating team of fascinated residents who tried, and often failed, to keep up with him. Most days, he wore a mini white coat with Dr. Lucas embroidered on the chest. The coat was oversized, his sleeves constantly rolled up, but he wore it like armor, like a promise. One afternoon, after a long case involving a neonatal valve reconstruction, I returned to the staff lounge to find Lucas with Diane and 2 cardiology fellows, explaining, seriously and meticulously, how his latest heart valve design might reduce infant recovery time. I stood in the doorway, silent, watching him gesture to his hand-drawn model, completely unfazed by the credentials surrounding him. He's not just brilliant, Diane whispered beside me. He's a storm. He was. That winter, I was nominated for the Pioneer in Pediatric Surgery Award to be presented at the Henderson Children's Cardiac Innovation Conference, the biggest stage I'd ever stand on. My new technique had gone global. Clinics in South Korea, Italy, and Brazil had adopted our minimally invasive approach, and behind every line of code, every scalpel incision, every published result was Lucas. But as the award ceremony approached, whispers began circulating. Some board members didn't think it was appropriate for a child to join me on stage. One anonymous donor had called it unorthodox. Others worried that it would raise questions about Nathaniel. I listened politely, then I ignored them all. Lucas was not just a reason, I told them. He was the result. On the night of the award, I stood at the top of the grand staircase in a dark navy gown, Lucas's small hand in mine. He wore a tiny tuxedo and a heart-shaped pin on his lapel that he'd made from an old EKG printout. As we descended the stairs toward the conference hall, the chandelier lights caught the edge of his grin. "You nervous?" I asked. "Nope," he said. "I practiced my line 10 times. The ballroom buzzed with dignitaries, surgeons, researchers, and the media. When our names were called, I led Lucas to the stage. His little shoes tapped the floor in rhythm with mine. As the audience hushed, I stood at the podium, heart pounding in my chest, not from fear but from awe. 6 years ago, I began. I stood in an OR, performing an emergency heart surgery while going into labor with the child you see beside me today. There were audible gasps, murmurs, surprise. I wasn't supposed to return to surgery so soon. I wasn't supposed to raise a child alone. I wasn't supposed to lead a groundbreaking technique in pediatric cardiology. And yet, here we are. I paused. Some hearts break, some hearts heal, and the rarest of all, some teach us how to live. Lucas stepped forward, right on cue, holding the crystal award in his hands. "Congratulations, Dr. Mommy," he said into the mic, earning a swell of laughter and applause that filled every corner of the room. We hugged. The cameras flashed, and across the ballroom near the back a shadow moved. Nathaniel. I spotted him just as he stepped out of the light, slightly thinner, his tailored suit hanging looser now, the confident posture of a CEO now softened by something more human. He stood perfectly still, watching. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. Let him see. Let him understand. After the ceremony, while Lucas held court with a group of stunned medical students, explaining the difference between atrial and ventricular septal defects, Diane nudged me. "He left," she said quietly. "Didn't even try to come closer." "Good," I replied, but my voice caught just a little. Later that night, back in our apartment, Lucas ran to his room and pulled out his newest design, an infant heart valve with fewer moving parts. "It'll work better for really tiny babies," he said. Yawning halfway through his explanation, I kissed his head. "I believe you." That same week, I received word that a major journal wanted to feature my work on the cover. The photo they requested? Me and Lucas in the lab, working side by side. I said yes without hesitation. The next morning, as I read over publication proofs, my assistant walked in. "Someone's asking for you," she said, hesitating. "It's Margaret Chen." My eyebrows rose. "Helen's mother?" "She's with their legal team. Says it's urgent. I agreed to the meeting, unsure of what to expect. We sat in a private conference room. Margaret Chen slid a folder across the table. My daughter wants to secure your support in the next board vote, she said plainly. You control 18%, she controls 11%. If you side with her, you'll be the majority. I'm not interested in boardroom drama, I said coolly. This isn't drama, she replied. It's survival. Nathaniel is circling bankruptcy. Your silence gave him time, but that time is gone. Helen wants to absorb what's left, and she wants to do it cleanly. I flipped open the folder. Legal strategy, numbers, voting breakdowns. Why should I help her? I asked. Margaret folded her hands. Because it secures your son's inheritance, his legacy, and because, whether you want it or not, this company will be part of his story. Better to write that chapter yourself than let someone else do it for you. She had a point, and I hated that she did. That evening, after Lucas fell asleep on the couch, his hands still clutching a toy stethoscope, I drafted my vote. I emailed it to the board. I didn't contact Helen. I didn't need to. My silence was power. My pen, more than enough. 2 days later, I received confirmation. Nathaniel Grant was officially removed from any operational authority at Grant Tech. His shares were frozen pending investigation. The company would survive, but it would never again belong to him. Lucas would never know the empire his father built with lies. He'd only know the truth we shaped with purpose. Later that month, I received a package from the new board, a framed certificate naming the Children's Cardiac Wing at Henderson Memorial, the Lucas Bennett Center for Pediatric Innovation. It wasn't just my name on the plaque anymore. It was his. He was the future, and this time he had a name no one could bury in silence. The unveiling ceremony was small by design, just a handful of hospital staff, a few select reporters, and the tight circle who had walked this path with me from the beginning. The plaque glinted in the morning sunlight, mounted just outside the glass doors of the new pediatric cardiac wing. Gold letters etched into white stone read, "The Lucas Bennett Center for Pediatric Innovation." Below it, in smaller font, Dr. Lucas Bennett Grant, youngest certified medical researcher in U.S. history. I stood beside my son, now 9 years old, dressed in a custom lab coat nearly as crisp as mine, the sleeves properly hemmed this time. His dark hair had grown longer, always a little tousled despite his protests. But it was his eyes, sharp, determined, filled with a kind of calm intelligence that captured everyone. The media loved to call him a prodigy. But he was more than that. Lucas was a force. He shifted beside me, tugging slightly at the coat's sleeve. "Can I start the trials today?" he asked, eyes already drifting toward the research lab beyond the double doors. "After the tour," I smiled. "And lunch." His design, a pediatric heart valve sketched out at age 7, refined with our research team at 8, and now ready for human testing, had already gained attention from Europe, Asia, and Johns Hopkins. The FDA had fast-tracked it for rare pediatric conditions, not because of who he was, but because the science held up. And as he stood beside me, shaking hands with renowned surgeons and nodding politely at TV anchors asking questions far too complex for a fourth grader, I saw it, the man he would grow into. A man grounded in empathy, brilliance, and integrity. A man Nathaniel would never know. I caught movement in the back of the crowd. A tall figure in a dark suit, head bowed slightly, as if hoping to disappear. Nathaniel Grant. He looked older now, gray touched the sides of his hair. His posture, once confident and proud, had slouched under the weight of 1,000 regrets. He stood alone, just beyond the perimeter of the event, half in shadow. But I saw him. I didn't wave, I didn't nod, and I didn't look away. Let him stand there, behind the glass, watching his legacy unfold without him. After the unveiling, Lucas led a guided walkthrough of the lab. He beamed with pride as he explained the filtration chambers, the pressure testing stations, the AI-assisted diagnostic monitors he'd helped design the interface for. He was patient with the adults, kind, but direct. A reporter asked, "Lucas, do you know how famous you are?" He shrugged. "I just want to fix broken hearts." That night, back at home, I tucked him into bed. The lab tour had exhausted him, but he still clutched his notepad as he drifted off, pencil markings scrawled in half-finished formulas. I watched him sleep for a while, his breath steady, his brow still occasionally furrowing, even in dreams. Then I returned to my study. On my desk sat a stack of unopened mail, a few new journal submissions for peer review, and a thick envelope marked from Nathaniel's legal team. I opened it slowly. Inside were final documents confirming the full dissolution of Nathaniel's position at Grant Tech. Attached was a letter, not from him, but from his attorney. Our client respectfully relinquishes any remaining claims to the company and understands his visitation requests remain legally barred until Lucas reaches the age of majority. I set it aside. Beneath it was a smaller envelope, handwritten. I recognized the signature immediately. Nathaniel's. I opened it. Claire, if you're reading this, then I've stepped back for good. Not because I don't care, but because I know now what I cost you. What I cost him. I won't pretend that I didn't choose power. I did, and I lived with that choice every single day. But Lucas, he's something else entirely. He's what I never deserved. You gave him everything. I gave him absence. And yet, he became everything I should have fought for. Thank you for not letting my failure define him. For giving him the world. I'll stay out of it, unless one day he wants something different. Until then, I remain just someone who once knew your light and let it go. Nathaniel, I closed the letter. No longer angry. No longer wounded. Just done. 2 weeks later, an article surfaced online. Former Grant Tech CEO volunteers full-time at children's hospitals in Southeast Asia. No cameras, no headlines, just quiet service. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I didn't care if it was redemption or just a man trying to feel useful again. Let him find peace elsewhere. We had work to do. That spring, Lucas was accepted to an International Youth Fellowship in Medical Innovation. He declined. I want to stay with our team, he told me. Besides, we still haven't finished the neonatal prototype. I watched him present it to the research board, hands steady, voice even, explaining the function of the microleaflet membranes with precision that stunned even our lead engineers. I whispered to Diane afterward, "Do you remember when he couldn't pronounce mitral?" She chuckled. Now he's correcting the pronunciation of seasoned cardiologists. On the final day of the quarter, the hospital board held a closed review of our lab's progress. Lucas, seated beside me, took notes, fielded questions, and outlined our goals for the next phase of trials. When they left, one of the senior directors paused at the door. "Dr. Bennett," he said, then glanced at Lucas, "and Dr. Bennett, we're lucky to have you both." Lucas grinned, then leaned toward me. "Race you to the conference room." "Not fair," I said, pretending to stretch. "You're 9, I'm old." "Excuses," he teased, then sprinted down the hallway, his white coat flapping behind him. I ran after him, laughing, heart light. 9 years ago, I had stood in my kitchen holding a pregnancy test, my world crumbling around me. Now, I stood in the hallway of the most advanced pediatric cardiac center in the region, chasing the very heartbeat that had saved my own. We weren't just healing hearts anymore. We were building something better, together. And whatever echoes Nathaniel had left behind, they were now whispers in the distance, barely reaching the walls we built with love, sacrifice, and brilliance. Lucas turned at the door, breathless, triumphant. "You're slow, Dr. Mom." I leaned against the frame, catching my breath. "But I'll always catch up." And I would, wherever he ran, however high he climbed, because some empires fall. But the strongest ones grow, one heartbeat at a time. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means this journey touched something deep inside you, just as it did for us while telling it. This wasn't just a story about betrayal and loss. It was a story about choosing resilience over revenge, love over ego, and legacy over bitterness. Claire didn't just rebuild her life, she redefined it. And through her strength, she raised a child who would go on to heal others. That's the kind of power we all carry within us, the power to turn pain into purpose. What about you? Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where our incredible viewers are tuning in around the world. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share powerful emotional stories like this every week, stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Your next favorite story might be just one click away. See you in the next video.